Chapter 11, The Crystal Cave. "The secret door," whispered Jack. "Yes," said Annie. Jack dropped the compass into his pack. Then he and Annie scrambled through the bushes and climbed up the rocks to the door. Annie took Sir Lancelot's glass key from around her neck. She slipped the key into the keyhole. She turned the key slowly. Click! "Yippee!" Annie said softly. She pushed open the door. Beyond the door was a huge, glittering cave. The floor, walls, and ceiling were made of clear crystal. Jack and Annie stepped inside. The cave was filled with dancing streams of purple light. "It's so bright," whispered Jack. "Where's all the purple light coming from?" "There," said Annie. She pointed to a crack on the far side of the cave. "Let's look." They crossed the cave and peered through the crack into a room. Along the brilliant crystal walls of the room were 4 doorways. In the far corner of the room was a fire. The fire blazed with leaping purple flames. Over the flames hung a gleaming golden cauldron. "There it is," whispered Jack. "Wow," whispered Annie. "The cauldron with the water of memory and imagination," whispered Jack. "I know," whispered Annie. "Let's go." They squeezed through the crack, then walked toward the gleaming cauldron. Jack reached into his pack and pulled out Sir Galahad's silver cup. "The cauldron's too high," said Annie. "We can't get to the water." "Here, take this," said Jack, handing her the cup. "Climb on my back." He bent over and Annie climbed on piggyback. Jack stood up shakily. "Hurry," he said. "You're heavy." "Can't reach it," said Annie. "Move closer." Jack staggered forward a few steps, stretching as far as he could, and she could. Annie reached again. She skimmed water from the top of the bubbling cauldron, filling the silver cup. "Got it," she whispered. "Now set me down, slowly." Annie held the cup in both hands. Jack slowly bent his knees, and Annie climbed carefully off his back. They stared silently for a moment at the water of memory and imagination in the cup. It was clear and shimmering. "Now we can save Morgan," said Annie. Just then Jack smelled something strange. It was like the smell of rotten seaweed. He heard weird gurgling sounds behind them. He and Annie turned around. A giant, slimy, mud-colored creature crawled out through one of the doorways. The creature was long and scaly like a crocodile, but much, much bigger. It had wings that looked as if they'd been spun from 1,000 spider webs. It had glowing red eyes and long, curled claws. The creature opened its huge jaws. Strands of drool dripped from its sharp-pointed teeth. The creature hissed, and hot blue flames shot from its mouth. Another monster crawled through a different doorway, quickly followed by a third and then a fourth. "Yikes," said Annie. "The real keepers of the cauldron," whispered Jack. Chapter 12, Fire with Fire. The 4 real keepers of the cauldron crawled closer to Jack and Annie, hissing and snorting blue fire. "What do we do now?" whispered Annie. "I don't know," said Jack. "We're trapped." "I have an idea," whispered Annie. "Let's drink the water." "What?" said Jack. "It's the water of memory and imagination, right?" said Annie. "So maybe if we drink it, we can imagine a way to escape." "That's crazy," said Jack. The keepers crawled closer, snorting more blue flame and filling the air with their rotten stench. Okay, let's try it," said Jack. Annie took a sip from the silver cup, then handed it to Jack. His hands trembled as he held the cup to his lips and took a sip. The water tasted sweet, bitter, and spicy all at the same time. Jack gave the cup back to Annie. "Now imagine we're saved," she said. Jack closed his eyes. He tried to imagine being saved. He pictured the 4 keepers crawling back through their doorways. "Okay, ready to fight," said Annie. Jack opened his eyes. "What? Fight?" Annie set the silver cup on the floor. "Now," she said. Suddenly Jack felt he'd been hit by a bolt of lightning. His fears slipped away. He was filled with strength and fury. Without thinking, he lunged with Annie toward the wood fire under the cauldron. They each grabbed 2 long, straight branches from the edge of the fire. They raised them high in the air. The branches blazed with purple fire like flaming swords. "Ah!" Jack and Annie shouted. The 4 keepers hissed louder than before. Great balls of blue fire exploded from their mouths and nostrils. Jack and Annie slashed the air with their fiery weapons, jabbing at the keepers. They fought fire with fire, blue flame with purple flame. "Back! Back!" they shouted. With each jab and shout, Jack felt stronger and braver. Waving their burning branches, he and Annie drove the keepers toward the walls. The keepers' blue flames grew weaker and weaker, as if they were running out of fuel. Finally, one by one, each keeper slunk back into the doorway from which it had come. When all the keepers had disappeared, Jack and Annie placed a burning branch in front of each of the 4 doorways to keep the monsters from coming back out. Then they brushed off their hands. "Let's go," Annie said coolly. Jack nodded. Annie carefully picked up the silver cup of water from the cauldron. Then she and Jack squeezed through the narrow crack and strode through the bright crystal cave. They stepped out into the daylight. The glass key was still in the keyhole. Jack calmly locked the door behind them. He handed the key to Annie. Then Jack's knees gave way and he sank to the ground. Chapter 13, Your Horses Are Waiting. "I don't believe what just happened," said Jack. "What part don't you believe?" said Annie, holding the silver cup. Jack laughed and shook his head. "I don't believe any of it," he said. Annie laughed too. "That was cool, huh?" Jack pushed his glasses into place and stared at her. "Seriously? What just happened in there?" he asked. "I imagined us fighting the keepers with flaming swords," said Annie. "What did you imagine?" Jack shrugged. I just imagined the keepers going back in their holes," he said. "Good," said Annie. "We both got what we imagined." "Yeah," said Jack, smiling, "but what you imagined made a much better story." A shriek of fury came from inside the cave. "Yikes," said Annie. "Let's get out of here," said Jack. He scrambled to his feet, and together they climbed back down over the big rocks to the thicket. Annie moved very carefully to keep from spilling the water in the cup. When they came to the thicket, Jack pulled out Sir Percival's compass. "If we came west to get here, we have to go east to go back," he said. "East is that way." As they started into the wild growth, Jack went first so he could clear the way for Annie. Without talking, they pushed steadily through the trees and bushes, moving farther and farther from the keeper's cave. Finally, they heard music in the distance. They walked closer and closer toward the sound until they stepped back into the green glade. The winged dancers were still there, dancing in their magic circle. Jack's heart raced. He wanted to join them again, but he knew that if he did, he would never escape their dance. "Look," said Annie, "the knights are awake." Sir Lancelot, Sir Galahad, and Sir Percival were standing just beyond the circle of dancers. They were buckling on their swords. "Hi," called Annie. "Guess what? We got it." The knights walked shakily toward Jack and Annie. They still looked thin and tired, but color had returned to their cheeks. "We have the water of memory and imagination," said Annie. She held up the silver cup. The knights smiled. "Now we just have to get it back to Camelot," said Jack. "We would like to help you," said Sir Lancelot, "but it seems we have lost our 3 horses." "No, you haven't," said Annie. "Your horses are waiting for you." "They're on the other side of the hill," said Jack. Jack and Annie led the knights over the hill. On their way, Jack picked up the red velvet cloak. When they came to the meadow, they saw the 3 horses. The horses neighed and cantered over to the knights. As Sir Lancelot stroked the mane of the black horse, he turned to Jack and Annie. "You can both ride back to Camelot with me," he said. "Thanks," they said. Jack fastened the red cloak around his neck. Sir Lancelot helped them onto the back of his horse, then climbed on himself. Annie sat behind Lancelot. She held on to the knight with her right hand. She held the silver cup in her left hand. "Can you carry the water without spilling it?" Jack asked her, worried. "I'll try," she said. Sir Galahad mounted the brown horse, and Sir Percival climbed on the gray horse. Then the 3 knights started through the pale green meadow. "Careful, careful," Jack whispered to Annie. I got it," she said. When they came to the iron gate, the knights drew their swords. "Open the gate in the name of King Arthur of Camelot," Sir Lancelot called. Though he still sounded hoarse, the knight's deep voice carried an amazing strength. The iron gate slowly swung open. Sir Lancelot urged his horse onward. The guards watched silently as the knights passed by them and started across the bridge. The 3 horses trod in single file over the wooden planks. Again, Jack was amazed by the difference between this world and the other world. Here it was dark and freezing and foggy. The red cloak flapped in the bitter wind. As the horses stepped off the bridge, they each neighed loudly. "Oh, wow," whispered Annie. Standing high on a rock in a swirl of fog was the white stag. Chapter 14, Return. The 3 knights gazed in wonder at the white stag. "Here, take this," Annie said to Jack. She handed him the silver cup. Then she slipped off the back of Lancelot's horse and ran to the stag. "Thanks for coming for us," she cried, throwing her arms around his neck. The 3 knights looked at Jack. "That's the white stag," said Jack. "He brought us here." "Are you wizards?" Sir Percival asked in a hushed voice. "No, just ordinary kids," said Jack, "but I know he's magic. We got here from Camelot in no time at all. I guess he's come to take us back." "Then you must go with him," said Sir Lancelot. "You will have a much faster journey, I can assure you." Sir Lancelot held the silver cup as Jack slipped down from the black horse. Then Jack took the cup and carefully climbed onto the back of the stag behind Annie. He held the cup with both hands as the stag stood up. "Tell King Arthur we will return to Camelot before the first night of the new year," said Sir Lancelot. "Farewell, Jack and Annie," said Sir Galahad. "Godspeed," said Sir Percival. "Same to you," said Annie. "Have a safe trip," said Jack. The knights solemnly bowed. The white stag blew out a puff of frosty air, then he started down the mountainside. When the stag came to the base of the mountain, he took off again like a white comet. The red cloak billowed around Jack and Annie, keeping them warm and safe. The stag dashed across the wintry fields. He ran past quiet stables and thatched huts. He ran past flocks of sheep and herds of goats asleep in meadows. He leaped over frozen streams and stone walls and hedgerows. The stag ran on and on through the starry night until he brought Jack and Annie back to the dark castle grounds of Camelot. He walked over the frozen grass of the outer courtyard. He came to a halt near the grove below the treehouse. He knelt in the grass, and Jack and Annie climbed off his back. Miraculously, the silver cup still brimmed with water from the cauldron. Not a drop had spilled out. "You better leave the cloak here," said Jack, "so I don't trip on it." Jack carefully set the cup on the ground. Annie helped him unbutton the red velvet cloak from around his neck. Then she draped it over the stag's back. "To keep you warm and safe," she whispered to him, "and thanks for everything." "Yeah, thanks," said Jack. "Bye-bye." The white stag stared at them with his mysterious amber eyes. He nodded once, then he turned and headed into the darkness. Jack picked up the cup. "Come on," he said. He started walking quickly through the outer courtyard. "Careful, careful," said Annie. I got it," said Jack. They crossed the drawbridge to the inner courtyard of the castle. Then they pushed open the giant arched doors. The great hall was just as they had left it, dimly lit and freezing cold. King Arthur, Queen Guinevere, the Knights of the Round Table, and Morgan Le Fay were all still frozen and silent. "What do we do now?" said Jack. "Let's try putting a drop of water on each of them. Morgan first," said Annie. "Okay," said Jack. "Come on." Holding his breath and keeping his eyes on the cup, Jack walked carefully toward the round table. Suddenly, his left foot slipped on the shoelace of his right sneaker, and he stumbled. "Jack!" yelled Annie. Jack tried to regain his balance, but it was too late. As he fell to the floor, the silver cup slipped from his hands. Christmas Magic, Chapter 15. Jack and Annie watched in horror as the water from the cup splashed over the stone floor. It trickled into the cracks between the stones and disappeared. Jack scrambled to the cup. He picked it up. It was completely empty. "Oh no," Jack moaned. He sat back and put his head in his hands. "Camelot will never wake up now," he thought. "The legend will end forever." "Jack," said Annie, "look." Jack raised his head. He pushed his glasses into place. A golden cloud was rising from the cracks between all the stones of the floor. The cloud spread quickly throughout the great hall, filling the room with wonderful smells, the scent of cedar smoke and evergreen, of roses and almonds. The cloud rose up and up, then wafted out through the upper windows of the hall. Suddenly a white dove flew through one of the windows. It soared across the dark room like a bright light, then swooped back out into the night. Soft, gentle laughter came from the end of the hall. The laughter grew louder. Jack saw King Arthur and Queen Guinevere looking at one another. They were laughing too. The knights of the Round Table were laughing too. Best of all, Jack saw Morgan Le Fay smiling at him and Annie. "Jack, Annie, come here," she called. She held out her arms. "Morgan," cried Annie. She ran to Morgan and threw her arms around the enchantress. Jack stood up. Still holding the empty cup, he ran to Morgan and hugged her too. "We did what the Christmas night told us to do," said Annie. "We brought back the water of memory and imagination." "But I dropped the cup," said Jack, "and spilled all the water." "But the water made a gold cloud," said Annie, "and everyone came back to life." Morgan laughed with amazement. "You have just returned from the other world?" she asked. "Yes," said Annie. "A white stag brought us back," said Jack. He turned to King Arthur. "Your Majesty," he said, "we have good news. Your knights are safe. Sir Lancelot said to tell you they'll be home before the first night of the new year." The king looked bewildered. "You found them?" "Yes, and they're all fine," said Annie. "Here," said Jack. He handed the silver cup to the king. "Please give this back to Sir Galahad." "And this to Sir Lancelot," said Annie. She took the glass key from around her neck and gave it to King Arthur. "Oh, and this to Sir Percival," said Jack. He pulled out the wooden compass box from his pack and gave it to the king. At first, King Arthur was too stunned to speak. Then he clapped his hands and laughed joyfully. "Thank you," he said to Jack and Annie. The knights of the Round Table all cheered. "Ring the bells," King Arthur shouted. "Call the people of Camelot to the castle." "They'd already gathered outside the doors, your Majesty," said a page. "Bring them in," said King Arthur. "We must rejoice together." Queen Guinevere smiled at Jack and Annie. Her eyes sparkled now. "Once again, you have helped save Camelot," she said. "Thank you very much." "You're welcome," said Jack and Annie together. Then Jack heard the sounds of children talking and laughing. He turned to see a crowd of people streaming through the arched doorway of the great hall. They carried candles, a giant fir tree, and boughs of holly and pine. Musicians followed them with stringed instruments. As everyone started to decorate the hall, the musicians began playing and singing a beautiful Christmas carol. "Jack," said Annie, "look!" The white stag was standing in the arched doorway. Jack turned excitedly to Morgan. "See that white stag?" he said. "He took us to the other world. See him?" Morgan smiled. "Yes, I do see him," she said. "And now I know everything." Jack looked back at the doorway. The stag was gone. In his place stood an old man with a long white beard. He held a staff and wore a flowing red cloak, the same cloak Jack and Annie had worn on their quest. "Who's that?" Jack said. "That is Merlin the magician," said Morgan. "It was Merlin who invited you here. I see that now." "Merlin," said Jack. "He sent us the royal invitation?" "Yes," said Morgan. "Then he put the rest of us under a spell, and he carried you to the other world." "No," said Annie. "The Christmas night put you under a spell." "And the white stag carried us to the other world," said Jack. Morgan smiled. "Merlin was both the Christmas night and the white stag," she said. "Remember, he's a magician, not a mortal. He can change his shape whenever he wishes." "Oh, wow," whispered Annie. "Why did Merlin do these things?" said Jack. "Merlin was angry when King Arthur banished magic from Camelot," said Morgan. "I see now he finally took matters into his own hands." "How?" said Jack. "He knew King Arthur would send no more knights to the other world for the water of memory and imagination," said Morgan. "So I assume he brought you to Camelot, hoping that you would offer to go instead." "Why did he want us to go?" said Annie. "Merlin has often heard my tales of your adventures in the tree house," said Morgan. "He knows you both have a great desire to fight for the good, and he knows you use the gift of imagination very well. Those are two special qualities needed to succeed in any quest." Jack and Annie looked back at Merlin. From far across the room, with the white-bearded magician smiled at them. He raised his staff, then he slipped out the door. Jack looked around the great hall. All the candles and torches were lit now. A fire blazed in the hearth. The musicians were playing. Everyone was singing. The room glowed with warm firelight and rosy faces. At last, Christmas in Camelot was just as Jack had imagined it would be. The spell of the dark wizard had been broken. The great hall was filled with beauty and love and joy and light. Chapter 16, Welcome Home. "Wake up, Jack," said Annie. Jack opened his eyes. He was lying in the dark on the wooden floor of the treehouse. Through the window he saw the cloudy sky above the Frog Creek woods. "Time to go home," said Annie. "Oh, I must have fallen asleep," said Jack. "I had the most incredible dream. I dreamed that we went to Camelot. It was Christmas, and Merlin—" "That wasn't a dream," said Annie. "It was real. You fell asleep at the round table during the party. King Arthur carried you to the treehouse, and I made the wish for us to come home." Jack sat up. "Seriously?" he whispered. "Seriously," she said. "Jack, Annie," their mom called in the distance. "Coming," Annie shouted out the treehouse window. She turned to Jack. "Let's go." "I mean, seriously? It really happened?" Jack asked Annie again. "Yes, really," she said. "You held up the royal invitation. See? Proof." "Oh, yeah," he whispered. This time the letter M stood for Merlin, not Morgan, said Annie. Jack smiled. "Thanks, Merlin," he said softly. Jack picked up his backpack. Then he and Annie started down the rope ladder and headed home. As they walked through the deep December twilight, snowflakes started to fall. By the time they left the woods and headed down their street, snow was swirling everywhere. Ahead, they could see their house glowing with lamplight. Their mom was waiting on their front porch. "Hi, Mom," said Annie. "Hi, Mom," said Jack. "Hi, kids. Did you have a good day?" she asked. "Yeah," said Jack. "Pretty good," said Annie. "I'm glad," said their mom. "Welcome home." She held the door open, and Jack and Annie slipped inside. Their house felt extra warm and cozy. Good smells came from the kitchen. Jack and Annie took off their snow-covered jackets and headed up the stairs. In the hallway, Annie turned to Jack. "Merry Christmas," she said simply. "Merry Christmas," he said. Annie slipped into her room and Jack into his. Jack closed his door and sat on his bed. He took his notebook out of his pack and opened it. His spirits sank. Except for the 3 rhymes, he'd taken no notes on their journey. Not one. Exhausted, Jack lay back on his bed. He squeezed his eyes shut. He tried to remember the details of their adventures in Camelot and the other world. He could feel the terrible chill in the great hall when Morgan was frozen. He could hear the joyful music as the winged dancers danced around the circle. He could taste the sweet, bitter, spicy taste of the water of memory and imagination. Jack sat up. All at once he felt very awake. He turned to a clean page in his notebook. He grabbed his pencil and wrote, "It all started when we saw the white dove in the twilight." Using his memory and his imagination, Jack kept writing, doing his part to keep the legend of King Arthur, the Knights of the Round Table, Merlin, and Morgan Le Fay alive. As the snow swirled outside his window, Jack wrote and wrote and wrote. He didn't stop writing until he had written down the whole story, his story of their Christmas in Camelot. And that's the end of the book, but there is a note from the author at the end. Many people believe that the legend of King Arthur was inspired by an actual military leader who led Britain over 1,500 years ago. Imaginary stories about the adventures of King Arthur were first told in Wales and Ireland. These stories are called Celtic myths. Sadly, most Celtic myths are lost to us forever because only a few were written down. Many details in my story about King Arthur's realm are drawn from details in the few Celtic stories that have survived through the ages. The cloak that makes one invisible was considered to be one of the 13 treasures of Britain. Merlin the magician was said to keep the treasures in a glass tower. None of the magic of the treasures would work for a person who was unworthy to use them. The white stag was inspired by a supernatural Celtic beast that often led humans to a hidden underworld. The idea for the cauldron of memory and imagination came from a 6th century poem. The poem tells a story about King Arthur and his knights traveling to a hidden world and searching for a magical cauldron of poetry and inspiration. Many knights never returned from this dangerous quest. In the 12th century, Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine encouraged poets and troubadours to make up more stories about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table to inspire her people. In the following years, storytellers all over Europe told heroic tales of King Arthur, Merlin, Sir Lancelot, Queen Guinevere, and Morgan Le Fay. French poets were the first to call the imaginary kingdom Camelot. The storytellers of the Middle Ages blended elements of Christianity with the old Celtic myths. In their stories, miracles and marvels often took place around Christian holidays. Christmas in Camelot was a time of joyous celebration. Signed by Mary Pope Osborne. And at the back of that, there are fun activities for Jack and Annie and you. Christmas craft work. Talks about making an advent calendar and tells you how to do that. And there's a puzzle of memory and imagination. Jack and Annie learned many new things on their adventure in Camelot. Did you put your knowledge to the test with this puzzle? You can use a notebook or make a copy of this page if you don't want to write in the book. The name of King Arthur's kingdom. Remember her name? The name of the kingdom, that is? Camelot, right? The name of King Arthur's queen. It's a big long one. Guinevere. Spelling, you'll have to look back in the book. The shape of the table where King Arthur and his knights sit. It was the Knights of the Round Table. The most famous of Camelot's knights, Sir Lancelot, like the lances they used to use to fight with. The enchanted land where Morgan says magic began, the other world, right? They had to travel to the other world. And the white-bearded magician of Camelot, who turned out to be the knight and the stag as well, Merlin. Now look at the answers you got. The letters that are circled spell a word, but that word is scrambled. Can you unscramble it to spell the name of a certain kind of story? Here's a hint. This type of story begins with a little bit of truth, but is changed by the imaginations of different people in different times. So what kind of story is that? You have to go back through, and in each answer there is one letter that has a circle around it, and answer that correctly and unscramble them, and you will get your answer. Thank you for reading Christmas in Camelot with me, and stay tuned. You can click on the link to do the activities that I have planned to go with this book. There were activities at the end of the book as well. You're welcome to try them, but you also have other things you can do with me when you choose the other link and pick up your packet at the library. This has been Miss Kathy from Shaler North Hills Library. Bye.